Hello, I'm Cheryl Granger, and I am going to be discussing today the interactions I've had with the MHRA, and I thank the UK column for allowing me to do this presentation, and I hope you find it interesting. I have met quite a few of you before, and you'll probably realise that my background is working with pharma, and that is why I understood right from the start how illogical and unscientific the whole of the last 4 years has been. My work with UK column has taken me to investigate the MHRA, and I want to go through those aspects today. But I would like to say from the start, the idea of this is not to panic people. I think the strength that we have is when we're aware of what is going on, so that we can see what the problem is, and hopefully then we can work out what should be done. And the most important message is to stop any genetic therapies being used. So first of all, I would like to talk to you about safe and effective. Safe and effective is basically two terms that are described in the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries, that's a mouthful, code of practice. So this is the code that pharma works by. So in terms of safe, they define the word safe must not be used without any qualifications. And that is a very important aspect. Matt Hancock said the data so far in this vaccine suggests there will be no adverse reactions and so no liability. You can't state that anything has no adverse reactions. So what he said was a nonsense. The other point is that Dr. Alison Cave, who's the MHRA's Chief Safety Officer, she stated that patient safety is our highest priority, and it gets approved after a rigorous review of the safety, quality and effectiveness by the MHRA and the CHN, the Committee on Human Medicines. And the MHRA concluded that COVID-19 vaccines were safe and effective, and the benefits outweigh any risks. And that's something that I challenged Alison Cave on, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So in terms of effective, what does the Code of Practice state? It states that absolute risk and relative risk refers only to the relative risk, especially with regard to risk reduction, because it can make a medicine appear more effective than it actually is. And we can see that from the Lancet study that was done to work out what the marketing lie was in terms of the relative risk reduction that was used by each of the manufacturers. And you can see the percentages of effectiveness that were quoted at you. But in the Lancet study, the absolute risk was also calculated. And you can see there that the absolute risk reduction from these jabs is so much lower, and little more than 1% in some cases. The absolute risk reduction is basically worked out from looking at the whole population. So if you want to work out two groups, you might have 1,000 people in the vaccinated group and then 1,000 people in the placebo group. You might have one death in the vaccinated group and 2 deaths in the placebo group. You could say, and that would be the relative risk reduction, that the vaccines are actually 100% more effective than the placebo group in terms of reducing death. But what you have to do in terms of absolute is look at the whole group in total. So you looked at 2,000 people and you reduced the deaths by 1. And that's how you get an absolute risk reduction being a lot less, but more realistic. I can show you that this information has been used as the basis of the AstraZeneca court case that is looking at vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia. So the organisation that oversees the ABPI Code of Practice is actually the Prescription Medicine Code of Practice Authority. And they ruled that AstraZeneca had actually breached both of these clauses that I've just gone through. And the court case says the product, because of that, is defective when you actually look at the Consumer Protection Act 1987. So we're talking about VITT, This was first identified back in March 21 by Professor Scully, and she noted that she had 3 patients who had this most peculiar reaction. The court case, by the way, Professor Scully had written to notify Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Whitty, as well as the MHRA, about the existence of this vaccine-induced problem. So far, they list about 445 cases of VITT, and that has given, unfortunately, up to 81 deaths, which means it's got a mortality rate of about 20%. But the mainstream media is still saying that AstraZeneca is incredibly effective, and they go on to save 6 million lives globally by this vaccine, which I disagree with. The PMCPA also ruled another breach by Pfizer. Pfizer actually breached clause 3.1, and that was that you're not allowed to promote a product prior to getting its license, its marketing authorization. And the result of that was it was ruled that Pfizer had breached, and they faced a fine of £34,800. And that represents 17 seconds of revenue to somebody that has been making vast fortunes from the Pfizer vaccine. Basically, we have the different aspects that I have been working on through the MHRA. First of all, a freedom of information that was sent out to try and obtain the AstraZeneca data. So this was sent out and signed by 26 members of HEART, and it looked official. It was badged by PJH Law. And what we wanted to do was get hold of the AstraZeneca data that they had the MHRA had robustly, as they keep using this word, robustly reviewed for license to obtain their marketing authorization. I was encouraged because the US had managed to get hold of the Pfizer and now the Moderna data, and seen as AstraZeneca was used throughout the world, and in particular in the UK, that is something that we needed to see. So we're talking about transparency here. Transparency must be upheld. Despite 1 billion doses of AstraZeneca vaccines are being used in 170 countries, the entire purpose of the Freedom of Information Act is to show government transparency. And I've got a quote here from John McCain, who's a US politician, and he says, excessive administrative secrecy that feeds conspiracy theories and reduces the public's confidence in the government. So perhaps that's where the conspiracy theories that we keep being accused of has come from. So when I received a reply from the MHRA, of course, the response was a rejection. And this is an S14, a Section 14 rejection that covers vexatious behaviour. So that is governing the scope of the request. And basically, we're saying that inefficiency as a reason for the burden, we believe, is not valid. But they still threw this rejection at us. They also threw in disproportionate burden. So that's the public interest does not outweigh the resource burden. So that means your interest, the public's interest in finding out information about a product that's been injected in millions of people, that does not outweigh the burden that we put on the MHRA asking for that information, which I think is unforgivable. These are excuses, and this can be challenged. So let's remind ourselves of what's happened. So the government has invested millions of our taxpayers' money. It's coerced a large percentage of the population to be injected with a liability-free vaccine. And we require complete government transparency to see this information. It's basically true that a denial would show utter contempt for democracy. And the data should confirm whether AstraZeneca vaccine is safe and effective. If they're behind that often phrase of safe and effective, why can't we see the information? And the public paid for these products and takes on the balance of benefits and harms post-vaccination. So we have a right to transparency of the data. And the next thing that I got involved with was asking a live question to the MHRA board, and this happened in March 23. So I asked, why has one of the most important regulatory activities, so that's pharmacovigilance, the main reason for the existence of the MHRA, especially over a period of 2 years of multiple injections given to millions of people, has there been a curtailment? And these are all the ways that the MHRA are supposed to monitor pharmacovigilance, including at the bottom there, the listings of freedom of information requests. They stopped listing for quite some time. So I asked the question, and Alison Cave, the Chief Safety Officer, had got a prepared answer. And she went on and talked about, again, that word robust monitoring that they've been doing. They had sourced additional data from academia, which of course we know is paid for. We were told that they had changed the reporting system to a monitor. They then had moved the yellow card to as required publishing with the interactive drug analysis profile. This was due, and this was according to the Committee on Human Medicines, due to a very stable safety profile of the vaccines. They moved away from the yellow card to this as required publishing. Every single adverse event was investigated, we were told, and the MHRA had paid huge attention to detail. And what they always assert is the benefit risks remain positive. You might always talk about risk-benefit analysis, but here in the MHRA, we always talk about the benefit risk ratio, although we never find out what the benefits are. So I say that there's regulatory failure happening on a global scale. We're actually seeing willful blindness on causation. They don't see links. The criteria for causality can be shown. The trust of the public needs to be maintained is one of the main cries of the MHRA, as if they had trust in the first place. And we basically have lack of trust in the ability to protect the public. And there's no evidence backing any comment that Alison Cave actually gave. So her answers were uninformed, and we believe that she's not telling the public the truth. So let me just show what Dr. Tess Lawrie actually stated. And this was by June 2021. So we'd been having injections for just over 6 months. She analysed the data. She's a director of evidence-based medicine, and she said the MHRA now has more than enough evidence on the yellow card system to declare the COVID-19 vaccines unsafe for humans, and that was in June 21. And you can add to that what Dr. Jessica Rose, the Canadian independent analyst and researcher, said by October 2021. She's analysed a lot of the VAERS data in the States. When evidence of harm appears, we need to follow the evidence and immediately take steps to mitigate risks. So after I asked my question and after Dr. Alison Cave gave me her answer, I was then asked by the chair, Stephen Lightfoot, whether I had my question answered. And I was building up as I sat there to decide what to ask. And my response was to ask for more information. And I asked whether they give me more information on why we are seeing one serious adverse event for each of 426 doses that are given. And this can be shown on the table of the total number of doses, the number of deaths, and the number of serious adverse events that we're getting for every 426 doses. And I was fobbed off. I got rid of. I felt that I was dismissed and was told that it's not a meeting to talk about specific details. When can we talk about specific details is what I would like to have asked the chair of the board. So we've got a look at the MHRA and how it does its data analysis. We know from ICANN, that's the Informed Consent Action Network in the States. They have a lawyer, Aaron Siri, who he heads up a series of lawyers who constantly write freedom of information requests. And they asked of the FDA to release the Pfizer data, which is now 451,000 pages, and the Moderna data at a later date, which very, very surprisingly is 4.8 million pages. These documents, these common technical documents, will be the same that are given to every regulator. And these documents used to be delivered by truck to the offices of the MHRA before we had everything digital. So here we're talking about a unique source. It's a primary source of documents and data. And these have been analysed, and we'll come on to that in a little while. But let's just think back to the MHRA and them being sent the common technical document. So we have the three vaccines used here, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna. Those are the dates when they received the data and they completed it. So think back to how many pages of data they were supposed to sift through during that time. And you can see that it took no more than 3 months to review each of them, and most of this was going on at the same time. It's very strange because trials were always done on animals first, and then you went through phase 1, 2, and 3, and then you got your license, and then phase 4 happened when you were out in the community, when obviously a lot more people were given the drug that was based on passing the clinical trials. These trials were done in steps so that you could see if there were any safety and efficacy issues, because the cost of developing a drug is enormously high, £1 billion plus, and therefore you'd want to stop any treatment from going any further into expensive trials if it wasn't getting anywhere. But in this case, there was no problem with actually funding the development of these vaccines, and the rolling review was employed by the MHRA so that it could get all the data as it came available and roll through it. I'd also like to point out that at this point, the MHRA had staff working from home because we were in lockdown. In an answer to one of my freedom of information requests, I was told that the computers keep crashing. That's why it was difficult to actually send me the results of my freedom of information request. And also, they were about 20% down on staff at this time in 2020. They also had digital contractors, so staff were coming in and were employed from outside. Staff that they did manage to recruit, they tell us at many MHRA board meetings, were actually very inexperienced, and therefore that takes time to get the experience to be efficient in your role. And of course, in terms of the manufacturing units, they did virtual inspections, which means that they were not going in and seeing how a manufacturing unit was actually working face to face. So let's see what Dame June Rain, the CEO of the MHRA, has actually talked to us about over the time. I asked the question, does she actually believe what she says, what she's actually telling us? First quote there, our assessors have worked around the clock reviewing hundreds of pages of data. Well, we know there are thousands of pages of data, and it takes a lot longer than they had allowed to get through it all. She also said we approved the vaccine trials within about a week, sometimes shorter. I'd suggest that that was very difficult to do. The MHRA got the CHM involved with their specialist committees in order to analyse this data. So again, how on earth did they do that within a week? They spent long hours, weekends and evenings spent looking at data as soon as it appears. That's part of the rolling review, rushing through everything. So how were they doing this when they weren't used to working from home, when they weren't used to the computer systems that they had that kept crashing? We had very comprehensive data, and there was no doubt that the vaccine was highly effective and the safety profile was one we could have anticipated. Could they not have worked out the efficiency data that I showed you when I started talking about this? Did they not have enough information to work out the relative risk ratio and the absolute risk ratio? But right from the start, they've been talking about highly effective and the safety profile being fine. So I'd like to state that these MHRA answers that we've been given since the start of the vaccine rollout have not been informed. They've not been telling us the truth. They've lost the ability to protect the public from harmful substances. Their role is pharmacovigilance. They're supposed to protect the public from harmful substances. So I believe that the MHRA has demonstrated duplicitous and disingenuous behaviour, and therefore you can conclude that it's demonstrated malfeasance in public office, and this is something that they have to be challenged on. What we can do is we can compare the MHRA with the EMA, so the European Medical Agency. So when we completely left Brexit in terms of the EMA, we actually had separation on the 1st of January 2021. So that was right at the start of the vaccine rollout. The MHRA produced, from analysing the data, public assessment reports, which don't tend to be very detailed. They don't contain references. And the strange thing is, they don't actually ask or challenge anything within them. The EMA, they produce open assessment reports, and they are more detailed, and we have seen analyses of these. And one of the best analysis that I've seen is by Dr. Vanessa Schmidt-Kruger. She was originally on the Corona Investigative Committee being interviewed by Dr. Rainer Fuellmich. And what you can see from what she's written is an analysis of all three vaccines. And one of the first things to point out, you might have heard of process 1 and process 2 in terms of Pfizer, but 2 processes have been used for each of the vaccines. So the processes is the manufactured product that is used in clinical trial, and perhaps a different manufactured product that is then rolled out and is the commercial product that is used by the public. She describes Pfizer having P1 and P2. AstraZeneca for clinical had P1 through to P3, and the commercial product was called P4. And with Moderna, they had scale A to initial B, and then a final scale B as the commercial product. All these things were different from each other. And the EMA at least queried this and said that they needed to see equivalent data between the 2 processes. Let me point out that the EMA did ask many questions, but at the end of the day, they didn't actually get any answers from what we can tell. So why did they do this? Well, if you are then going to move from clinical trial to mass production, it can be very expensive to produce it in the same way. So we might want to lower costs by having a different commercial process. What we've got is inconsistency of product in the products that have been produced. Perhaps that's due to the virtual inspections that have been done. We have considerable deficiencies in the products, and we've also got contaminants that are making ineffective products, as well as contamination with DNA, E. coli microbes, and then RNases, which is the enzyme that breaks down the RNA. We've also got the sterility of the product, because obviously anything that's going to be injected into a body has to be sterile. And of course, good manufacturing practice, GMP, seems to have been ignored. If you talk to Hedley Rees, he will tell you that none of the rules that are set about manufacturing have been followed over the last 4 years. We had certain issues that were worrisome. So in the trials, the clinical trials, there were 3 weeks between the doses given of the first and second vaccines. Then when they rolled them out, it didn't seem to matter which vaccine you were given for the first and second and the boosters. They were mixing vaccines. When we first started rolling things out, the vaccinated had to sit for 15 minutes to make sure there was no anaphylaxis or other side effect that presented itself very quickly. The whole thing was supposed to be under strict temperature control. What happened to that? Where were the trucks that were able to transport these vaccines at the temperatures that they were supposed to transport them at? When it came to mixing, because, for example, with the Pfizer vaccine, it came as a powder that was frozen in a vial, and there was no standard operating procedure to actually tell you how to mix. A lot of people were looking things up in the administration centres on Google. What happened was you had to defrost the frozen stuff in the vial. You then had to add in the saline, and then you were supposed to turn it 10 times very slowly because it gets affected by vibration. And of course, with vibration, there are problems with transportation and perhaps squeezing things through needles. So there were lots of things that we didn't know about before these were all rolled out. And the main concern was that instead of being a genetic therapy intervention, these were actually called vaccines, and therefore the testing is different. And lots of things like the effects on DNA and the genes and the infertility and pregnancy and what have you was all ignored. It wasn't done. So let's go back just quickly to summarise this. We basically have the 3 companies that produce the vaccines, and with the open assessment reports, those were the number of objections and recommendations that the EMA made, and they were all due dated. So in the open assessment report, which was written in January 21, the EMA specified these objections and recommendations that it wanted answers to, and it was due dated July 2021, and we don't believe that they ever came back. So they were licensed before we got the answers to questions that were very obvious to ask. So Dr. Vanessa Schmidt-Kruger's assessment basically was that it's criminal, it's unbelievable, and it's gruesome that they allowed these to be licensed and used. June Rain basically, as stated in her presentation to the All Wales Therapeutic and Toxicology Centre, that's a bit of a mouthful, she made this presentation on the 17th of November 2022, and it was called Making Medicine Safe. And within this, she made the classic comment of being an enabler. And she called herself, instead of a regulator, instead of a controller, watchdog, policeman, she is now the enabler. The MHRA enable products to be released. And the quote that I found very troubling was that she had an impulse for rushing things through, is a belief that we mustn't keep the patients waiting. So we've got to rush medicines to the public and look at the safety when they are in use. That's what she was telling us. She talked about the proportional reporting ratio, which looks at way of assessing data. And when Norman Fenton looked at the CDC information on PRR, he stated that we should halt the vaccines immediately because of the signals that was shown. Safety Connect is looking at 16 million registered people looking at their data. We've also got the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, which looks at 3 billion consultations that have been done within general practice. Pharmacogenetics, which is looking at the changes by drugs on genes. They talk about personal prescribing, which have just been announced as being rolled out for cancer. Basically, that all depends on what people are prepared to put up with. So are you prepared to put up with more side effects if you are being treated for cancer? And then also genetic mapping. And I found this particularly worrying So with the vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia patients, she said at that time they had about 300 they were aware of. They'd started genetically assessing them. They'd started looking into their genes to see what was wrong with them in order to determine why they were getting a side effect. So it's not the drug's fault, it's not the vaccine's fault, it's the patient's fault that there's something genetically different about them. She also mentioned Paxlovid, the antiviral treatment. And Paxlovid, she said, was safer by means of the MHRA anticipating results. Well, I don't believe this. 643 drug reactions are listed for Paxlovid, and 239 of them are actually major drug interactions, which means they will cause problems if taken at the same time. And of course, the other thing is it's supposed to be an antiviral. But 20% of patients put on Paxlovid actually get a rebound of COVID. And that is 1 in 5. That isn't acceptable. So the MHRA are either not doing the COVID vaccine surveillance that it promised to do, or the MHRA are doing the surveillance and it's not making the results public available. And that is not what their remit asked them to do. They are supposed to be transparent and let us see the data. So part of this information that is assessing the data involved the yellow card vaccine monitor. And this is something that June told us at the same meeting. But first of all, let me just say about pregnancy, because this is the part of the vaccine monitor that I'm particularly interested in. So in April 2021, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunology, the JCVI, stated that benefits outweigh the risks in pregnancy. There you are, benefits against risks again, and advised that pregnant women should be offered COVID-19 vaccines and boosters. And I suggest that that is misinformation. The NHS, that was stating that the evidence shows that most pregnant women with COVID-19 who need hospital treatment are unvaccinated, and it is safe to have the vaccine during any stage of pregnancy. And I believe that that is misinformation. So June mentioned the yellow card vaccine monitor, and she mentioned it in particular with pregnant ladies. And that is because she said that the vaccine monitor allows us to have a denominator. So the denominator means that she said there were 2,000 pregnant ladies, and we could see the information very clearly from that. What she didn't go on to say, apart from telling us that there was a presentation that was reported to the Pharmaceutical Expert Advisory Group in July 21, that actually showed, when we managed to get a copy of the interim report, that there were 30,000 people registered in this monitor. It's a bit like the VSafe in the States, only they had 10 million people on that. But it was basically people were asked if they would register and therefore be asked questions on a regular basis as to what side effects they might have been seeing, what effect the vaccine had had. So they were contacted on a regular basis after vaccination. In fact, June was wrong. There were 1,366 maternal exposures by the 30th of June 2021. And we know that 565 adverse reactions were seen, but they'd only got 8 live births at that point. So most women were still pregnant as of the 9th of the 7th, 21. And I believe this is signals that should be flashing at everybody. So here we have got, if you look at the whole group, the 30,000, 1 or more adverse reactions were seen on average in 53% of the body of people. And if you look at the number of people who were pregnant, AstraZeneca, 66% got an adverse reaction, Pfizer, 38%, and Moderna, 61%. And we have known this information now for 3 years, okay? We know that the Pfizer and Moderna document analysis, that I'll say a bit more in a moment, That has 6 reports that look at the known effects that they knew before they licensed the product, that the regulators would have seen within the data on fertility, pregnancy, embryos, and offspring development. So this is something that has been known, and this monitor confirms that they were seeing adverse reactions in pregnant women, and they won't publish the data. So what we have done is sent off another freedom of information to try and get the monitor data. That was rejected as a Section 22, and that means that it's going to be peer reviewed and then it's going to be published in a scientific journal. And we were told that it was going to be published late 23, early 24. It hasn't been. And when we complained and said that this was wrong, they upheld this ruling by internal review. And then when we went to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, they also upheld the ruling. And therefore, we now have no alternative but to go to tribunal. And so we're appealing this ruling again through the ICO system. And there's questions that have to be asked. Why do they think this is a novel technology and methodology that's safe in pregnancy? Why is a peer review needed? You don't need to peer review real-time data. Why is the MHRA not acknowledging these high levels of adverse drug reactions? Why is it acceptable for pregnancy data not to be disclosed? And what happens if this data never gets published? How long do we leave it before we go back and complain again? And why is the MHRA stating the pregnant still to be vaccinated when their monitor shows harms? This is all very troubling, and it's troubling because the MHRA basically came out of committees that were developed on the back of the Medicines Act 1968, and that came into being after thalidomide, with 2 key changes with drugs intended for human use. So they stated that they could no longer be approved, drugs could no longer be approved purely based on animal testing, and the drug trials for substances marketed to pregnant women had to provide evidence that they were safe for use in pregnancy. So we got the MHRA, which replaced the MCA and the MDA in 2003, and that was the basis that they were set up on. So can we just look at the question that I asked to the MHRA board? And I asked this in November 23. And eventually, 3 months later, in February 24, I got an answer. So anything they don't want to ask at the board meeting gets put into a department within the MHRA. And eventually, 3 months later, they answered it. My question was, would the CEO and CSO, Chief Safety Officer, like to retract the often repeated label that they have associated with the vaccines of safe and effective, always without qualification? So Dr. Alison Cave stated the MHRA concluded that the COVID-19 vaccines were safe and effective and the benefits of the vaccines outweigh the risk. I told you I'd come back to that statement she made that I showed you at the beginning. So Dr. Cave answered me and she said no medicinal product is completely risk-free. And she also said the MHRA's role is to ensure vaccines meet applicable safety standards of safety, quality and effectiveness. We've never seen their safety standards. We've never seen the risks that they are talking about in relation to these vaccines. Safe and effective refers to the balance of benefits and risks remaining positive. What are those benefits? What can she list that's a benefit of taking these vaccines? And the vaccines are the best way to protect people from COVID-19, and they've saved thousands of lives. They don't prevent or protect against the infection. They don't prevent transmission. They don't prevent hospitalization. They don't prevent death. So how are they matching their license, which says that they protect against infection? And what is the evidence they've got that they save thousands of lives? Going back to this subject of absolute risk ratio, so the effectiveness of the treatments that she's talking about here. The senior lecturer in evidence-based practice quoted to me that the absolute risk reduction concealment is known as outcome reporting bias, and it's a misrepresentation of health information that has misled the public about the risk-benefit ratio of the COVID-19 vaccines. And concealing this type of information and silencing and censoring of the discussion is actually illegal. So all this is obviously very troubling. I've mentioned the Pfizer and Moderna document analysis, and you can see the whole of this on the UK column Situation Room, where we have 98 and more summary reports that are linked to the full reports. So this was basically carried out by the Daily Clout and 3,250 researchers and 250 lawyers who forensically studied all those pages of information that ICANN managed to get hold of some months ago. And we know from this about what Pfizer knew, because the first lot of information looked at was Pfizer. There's been a couple of reports on Moderna, but more to come. Obviously, they're sifting through millions of documents at the moment. So what Pfizer knew, they knew that the mRNA did not work. They knew that the efficiency claims were based on 170 out of 40,000 participants in the trials. We knew that the actual efficiency was much less than 50%. We knew that clinical trial data basically had strong conflicts with the real data that we were seeing once it was used in those first 3 months of rollout. There were 32,760 injuries in 6 months, and 20% of the reports were for developing COVID itself. 15% of those COVID cases were severe, and COVID infection was third on the list of adverse reactions from taking the vaccine. And we know that 200 died from COVID in the post-marketing study, which is that first 90 days after rollout. So that was a summary of some of the efficacy, and all these things you can look up on the Situation Room. And if you want more detail, once you've clicked on the right subject to see the condensed report, you can then link into the full report. And then with safety, we knew it travelled in blood across the blood-brain barrier, and we knew it produced spike over an undeterminate amount of time. In men in the clinical trials, the criteria was abstinence from intercourse or using 2 forms of contraception. Why did they say that? In the 3 months of the study, we had 270 pregnancies. So despite saying do not get pregnant, there were pregnancies, 270 pregnancies, but they only followed up 32 of these, and 28 babies of those 32 actually died. They also mentioned shedding. So this will be skin to skin, inhalation, and through bodily fluids and intercourse. By early 21, we knew that the myopericarditis existed, and that was before the EUA, the emergency use authorization, was used or allowed in teenage children. They eliminated the control group, the placebo group, after 4 months and offered them vaccination. There were manufacturing concerns within the data. And they talked about process 1 and 2. There were missing patients that were discovered within the data. There were processes that were missing. They concealed, manipulated, and delayed death data. And again, you can look this up. They had effects of the pseudouridine, which was the replacement in terms of the modified mRNA. So the modified mRNA replaced uracil with pseudouridine, and that has effects in its own right because the body doesn't recognize it. There were lots of assumptions, there was misinformation, there were protocol violations, there were vax failures that were analysed, and then there was substitution in Moderna trials. In one of the reports done, Moderna, because it didn't have this vaccine actually assessed, actually used another mRNA product to actually prove a point. And that was accepted when that mRNA content was more than in the Moderna vaccine, and it also meant that it had more lipid nanoparticle wrapped around it. So it's very strange how they ran their clinical trials. And don't forget, this information, which is prime data, it was asked by the FDA to bury it, first of all, for 55 years, and then they upped it to 75 years, which is why they went to court and were court ordered to release it. And when you come to the later reports, so report 95, 96 and 98 actually discusses the fact that it's a gene therapy and not a vaccine, and therefore should have been put to the right committees to actually analyse this data, not the vaccine safety committees, but the genetic product safety committees. So moving on to the situation appraisal. The lessons that we've learned is an article that is written by Stephanie Seneff and others. And it basically says that this is a gene therapy, but it hasn't been tested as such, which we've just been saying, and it can be shown from the document analysis. It talks about side effects that are seen in the cardiovascular system, the neurological system, the reproductive system, and the hematological systems in particular. It talks about malignancies and autoimmunity problems. It talks about the effect of multiple boosters, which have been rolled out over the last 3 years as leading to immune dysfunction. And it talks about the benefit risks. So the perceived benefits outweighed by disabling life-threatening harms. Not very good. And it also talks about safety and quality control. So the process 2, as we've mentioned, was not trialled. It was just rolled out for commercial use. And then we've got contamination with the DNA and the SV40, which is a cancer precursing gene. The risk benefit that we talk about is the contraindications from further injections. And the result of unacceptable harm to reward means that all this totted up together in terms of the lessons learned by this great body of scientists says that we should endorse and enforce a global moratorium. And in terms of the action of lipid nanoparticles, there's a whole list of descriptions that come out of the studies that are done on lipid nanoparticles. And I ask you this question: if you saw this list describing the product that was just about to be injected into you, would you take it? Potential harmful effects, damage to DNA, increased cancer risk, systemic toxicity, immune activation, safety and toxic concerns, highly inflammatory, lung-induced clotting, unacceptable toxic risks. And they're all taken, those statements, from the studies that have been done on lipid nanoparticles. So prior to 2020, BioNTech had focused on mRNA cancer treatments, and all its trials failed, but the results are actually a secret. So how did they believe that this was not going to be a problem when they actually injected it to so many people, not just cancer patients? Dr. Peter McCulloch states that this is a code for potentially lethal spike. There's no control over the quality and duration that manufacturing persists for, and there's no means of getting rid of the pseudouridine that we mentioned. So you get an uncontrollable amount of spike for an uncontrolled time, and it's complicated by many shots. You get a cumulative effect. And Dr. J.J. Cooey makes you think. He's actually said, implying that the irreducibility complex immune system is insufficiently understood, that they can augment this system by injecting a genetic signal in a toxic envelope, is audacious, crazy, and extraordinary. And the result of all this is the biology behaves differently in the body, and the immune system is very confused. And it's, a very worrying aspect that we don't know the future with any of these, but we need to start working on ways of getting rid of the toxicity that's been put into our body. And just to finish off, just to remind you of the mortality rate in 2020. We actually had the 12th best year in our history. And we basically can show that the mortality rate in 2020 wasn't much of a problem compared with what happened over time. And we know from what Ed Dowd discussed with us in his finance technology data that actuary tables from life insurance companies have shown that particular cohorts of people, working people under the age of 50, have been greatly affected by these vaccines. And this actually is so bad that it goes to a black swan event, which is a very unlikely event happening naturally. We've also got other things that we can look at, and he's looked at it, an American telling us about our own data. So the NHS sickness absence rate, so these are the people who work in the NHS, which employs about 1.8 million people, what their sickness rates are. And that has gone through the roof, which means that, again, we've got since 2021 a black swan signal coming through. And therefore, the quality of healthcare is going to be affected because people will be working while they're disabled or sick at probably 50 to 75% capacity. So that's having an effect on the NHS itself. And then the PIP data, which is our disability data, something that Debbie knows a lot about, that again has gone through major increases, especially in certain classes of organs. So, for example, hematological, there's been a 500% increase, and that's 25 standard deviations, if anybody knows anything about statistics. And then finally, we've got the UK excess death rates, which the ONS have tried to fiddle about with new formulas to try and change. But the rise, especially in younger people, is a very worrisome thing. And that is really my summary about what is happening and what is happening with the MHRA and what we need to be aware of. And we hope over the next few months to start talking more about the things that people can do if they have taken the vaccines to help to do a detox. And that is something that hopefully we'll bring to you as soon as we possibly can. Thank you very much for listening.